Hey, Darren.
Oh, how you going?
Well, Hashem, yourself?
You in Israel?
Absolutely.
Did you have to do the swab?
But then we left Dubai after Pesach and had a negative PCR. Got into Israel that night and ended up with a positive PCR test. So we spent 5 days in Bidud, both of us.
I thought nobody's checking that.
Oh no, you can't get past in Israel. You can't get past the front. Yeah, you got to get signed off to get out through immigration, and then they Ministry of Health would ring us, daily. I mean, we had calls in the morning and in the afternoon, seeing how we were and do we need things and asking any symptoms regularly. So they're being very
people who have got positive and just ignored the text.
We don't ignore the text because they're actually calling us as well. And continue to call us.
Anyway.
Yeah, it's all good. Mr. Nussbaum, how are you?
Shalom Aleichem, Mike. Michael?
Hi, how are you?
Hi. How you going? You in Yerushalayim?
Absolutely.
Yep. Lovely. Where?
Gedud HaIvri, right near the off Palmach, near the Jerusalem Theatre.
Oh, lovely. Lovely location.
Yeah, it's really good.
Everyone well?
Can't complain. Yeah, we are. We've got our clean bill of health and allowed to sort of venture out into the real world.
Yeah, great. And how was Pesach in Dubai?
Fascinating. It was it's an interesting place to visit. Very much a police state. If you like, it's like Singapore. I mean, it's
really so. Okay. Don't drop your chewing gum on the pavement. You're frozen up. We've lost you at the moment.
Like where nobody slow.
You must be cutting in and out. You're frozen at the moment, Mike. Yeah, now that's better. Got you back in. Yeah. So do you have to say Shechianu to do a Seder in Dubai?
I think Jews have been in the desert before.
But you had to do 2 Storim though, didn't you?
Yeah, we did.
איפה הייתם? מה? ואיפה מה? It always has השכחה. Israel השכחה. Okay, excellent. Michael, welcome from Israel. How are you feeling?
Thank you very much. Thanks for having me.
Thanks for having you. You don't charge extra. Oh, you brought the actual book. That's impressive.
Yeah, I brought it with me. There's no point in having it still in the bookcase.
Got it. Okay. Let's have a. It's quite dangerous to have a skier right before like an intense skier. Okay. We are, I believe, someone had the exact page. I'll tell you where we're up to. We are looking at the end. We started the hill for Kriyat Shema. And last time we discussed whether Kriyat Shema Bisman Hazeh, whether Kriyat Shema nowadays is D'oraita or D'Rabbanan. And we 1, 3. So I had it before. Yep. 1, 3. Yep. Correct. We're on page 132. And we said last week that the overwhelming opinion of the Rishonim is, of course, that Kriyat Shema nowadays is D'oraita. However, we saw there's Tosfot and Menachot who were of the opinion that Kriyat Shema Bisman Hazeh is D'Rabbanan, or always is D'Rabbanan. And that the term Vishinantam Levanecha was referring to, or this idea that that these words which I command shall be on your heart, Midi'oraita wasn't referring necessarily to Kriyat Shema, it was referring to any Torah. That's how Tosfot had to understand it. But as we know, that's the opinion of Shmuel, but the overwhelming majority of Rishonim and as practice la halacha is that the mitzvah of Kriyat Shema is midoraita. So what we're going to deal with today on page 132 is, well, how much of Kriyat Shema is actually deoraita? So which of the paragraphs is deoraita and which is only d'Rabbanan? So the Rashba in the Shut here in source 17 on page 132 deals with this, and this is in the context that we saw the whole discussion in Brachot and elsewhere was regarding Safek, right? Somebody cannot remember if they recited Shema or not. Do they have to repeat, right? That was the question that we saw. Yep, with me? Room and at home? Everyone's with me? Okay. So the nafkamina being, if it's d'oraita or d'Rabbanan, if in the case of Safek, I can't remember. So if it's d'oraita, you have to repeat it again. If it's d'Rabbanan, you don't have to repeat it again. So that's what the Rashba was dealing with in source 17, because the Rambam had paskined like the opinion that if one's in doubt whether one said Kriyat Shema, then you should repeat Kriyat Shema. And somebody asked the Rashba, how can the Rambam paskin such a thing? So that's what we're dealing with here in source 17. It says the Rashba as follows. Katavta od, you, the author of the question, wrote, She tamhata or tamahta al divrei harav. You were astonished with the words of the Rav, Rabbi Moshe Zal, the Rambam. She Katav, who wrote for Perek Sheni, the Kriyat Shema, the second paragraph of those Kriyat Shema. What did the Rambam write? Safek kara Kriyat Shema, Safek lo kara. If you don't know if you recited it or not, Chosev akora muvarech lefunei lacharei. You have to go and recite the brachos before and after. Beheach ech. Okay. Sorry, lost you there. Sorry, gentlemen. Let's continue. So what we were saying, the Rashba said, how can it be? This is what the Rashba was asked. And he says as follows. Va'ani omer, and I say, says the Rashba. V'ulai lamda od harav, perhaps the Rav, i.e. the Rambam, learnt, v'masha amar Rabbi Eliezer, that which Rabbi Eliezer says, Safek kara kriyat shema, Safek lo kara, chosev koreh, right? One opinion of the Gemara, of that of Rabbi Eliezer, was, if you don't know if you've said kriyat shema, you should read it. Amar stam, chosev koreh, the fact he just says in general, you repeat it and read, mashma, this implies, the kol parshiotehu koreh. You should repeat all the parshiot. Va'afal pisha ein deoraita ela pasuk rishon. So says the Rashba, even though only the first pasuk is deoraita, nonetheless, the implication is that you should repeat all of Kriyat Shema if you don't know if you recited it or not. What's the reason for such a thing? If only the first pasuk's deoraita. So he says there in the final paragraph, the time of the mill. So the reason for doing this is the kol shehu chayav likrot, anything which one is obligated to read, korehu beikar takanato. You read it according to the way it was originally enacted and instituted. In other words, what was the original takana was to read the full Kriyat Shema. And therefore, if you're in a case in doubt, true, says the Rashba, even though the first pasuk is all that's deoraita, nonetheless, when you read it and you repeat it, you should read the entire, in its entirety again. If you're not sure if you've read it or not, you should read all three paragraphs. What we do learn here, by the by, though, is that what? According to the Rashba, how much of Kriyat Shema is deoraita? Only the first pasuk. Not only the first paragraph, the first pasuk. Read it again. There's the bold there in the second paragraph. Mashvis implies the kol pashatehu koreh. You have to repeat all the pasukim, all of it. Va'afal pi she'ein de'oraita ela pasuk rishon. Only the pasuk rishon, only the pasuk Shema Yisrael is actually de'oraita, according to the Rashba. That's what we learn here by the way of what's going on through here. Only the first pasuk is de'oraita, according to the Rashba.
Where did he get to that conclusion?
Where did he get to that conclusion? So that's already an interesting question. Perhaps because that's where the real mitzvah of Kabbalah on Chut Shamayim is, and accepting the heavenly yoke upon oneself. Perhaps it's specifically there that one does that. But the Shulchan Aruch nonetheless rules that even like the Rashba said, that even though only the first pasuk according to the Rashba is Dioraita, nonetheless, when it comes to whether to repeat, you don't remember if you recited Shema, you should still repeat all three out of doubt, because that's the way that it was enacted, to say it fully. So you don't just chap again the first pasuk because now it's only Dioraita. You do it properly when you repeat it. Yes. Sorry.
Big time.
Kriyat Shema al Hamita. So it depends if the person's done Shema after dark at Mariv. It's two separate things, really. Kriyat Shema al Hamita is a separate.
Break it up.
Yeah, correct. As long as you're breading up, not with the brachot. That's true, but it's not. The assumption is if you've done Shema, if you've done, this is the question. If you've davened early, then really when you should like later you shouldn't you should say all three paragraphs. That's typically what we do if you've davened early Mariv. But if you've davened after dark, then you don't have to do all three paragraphs. Kriyat Shema al Hamita is usually a separate. Okay, so there's this idea of the first pasuk, perhaps because the first pasuk exemplifies Kabbalat Olach Shamayim. That's the ultimate pasuk. But the Gemara itself in Brachot over the page of source 18 distinguishes between not this, but rather between the first and second paragraphs, not the psukim, but the first paragraph versus the second paragraph. And this is regarding an uman, a worker, a laborer. The Gemara discusses that how much workers have to stop their labor in order to recite Shema on time. Or can they do it whilst they're simultaneously whilst working? Can they multitask? So that's the Gemara discusses in source 80. So Rav Rebbe, it should say Ramile Rebbe Mari Bareda Bat Shmuel Rav. So Rav Mari Bareda Bat Shmuel said to ask the following question, contradiction to Rav. Tanan, we learned in our Mishnah, Ha'umanim, workers or laborers, Korin Barosh Ha'ilan or Barosh Ha'nidbach. So the Mishnah says that laborers are allowed to recite Shema even when they're up the tree or on a wall, on a stone wall. They're allowed to still recite Kriyat Shema. Alma, we see from there, says Reb Mari, lo by kavana. They don't require kavana, right? Because the fact they're allowed to way up the tree, quickly, it's among Kriyat Shema's coming. They're allowed to recite Kriyat Shema. They don't have to get down and concentrate. They can do it mid-work. So it seems that they don't need real kavana. Or a minhi, but what about a contradiction from elsewhere? Right, we know from elsewhere, Hakore et Shema, someone, right, the Mishnah says, giving second paragraph bracha, one who reads Shema has to have kavanah. Shneimar, as it says, Shema Yisrael. Lahalan Homer, and later on it says, Hasket u'Shema Yisrael, listen and pay attention and hear, O Israel. Malahalam b'hasket, just like there it means to pay attention. Afkan b'hasket, also here it means to pay attention. So he asked the following contradiction to Rabbah. On the one hand, laborers don't have to get down the tree to recite Shema. Yet simultaneously, we're told that hasket, there's a command to pay attention to what you're saying. So what did Rava do? Ishtik. Rava didn't know the answer. He was silent. Amarle, so like every good teacher who doesn't know the answer, he turned to him and said, Midi shmi lecha baha. Okay, so what do you think? You the question. Okay, you're so smart. You asked the question. What do you think about this? Have you heard anything about this? Amarle, Reb Mary said to him, yes, I have heard the answer. Hachi Amar Rav Sheshet. This is what Rav Sheshet said. They're allowed to read, even though they're still up the tree doing the work, as long as they stop working while they're reading Shema. They don't have to come down from the tree. The workers don't have to come down from the tree, but they have to stop working whilst they're reciting Shema. We'll see why this is relevant in a moment. Tanya, but surely we learn in the bright asks in the Gemara. Beit Hillel, Omri Beit Hillel say, Oskim b'malachtam b'korin. You don't have to stop your work. You can keep doing your malacha whilst reading. Lo kasha, this isn't difficult, asks the Gemara. Haba perek rishon, haba perek sheni. So here it means the paragraph basically. So the Gemara, now we've seen, makes a distinction between the first and second paragraphs. The first paragraph of Shema, a worker has to stop their malacha. They don't have to come down the tree, but they have to stop the malacha while they concentrate. In contrast, when it comes to the second paragraph, the worker does not have to stop the malacha. They can keep hammering or whatever it is they're doing up the tree, picking fruit up from the tree whilst they're reciting the second paragraph. So the Gemara makes a clear distinction between the first and second paragraphs. This doesn't go unnoticed. And the Rif brings here as follows in the next source. Hi Peruka l'Divrei Rabbi Yochanan. So this answer according to Rabbi Yochanan, the Sfirulei who holds The by kavana b'chulei perek rishon, that you need kavana throughout the entire first chapter, first paragraph of Shema, kedavtina le'el, as we saw earlier. But according to Rava, Lav mishum de by kavana b'chulei perek rishon hu de amar de bet limim lachtan. It's not because you actually need kavana throughout the entire first paragraph. Ela mishum de lo lishve la araihu. It's so that the malacha, your work, should not look like it's arai. It shouldn't look like that. Sorry, your reading of the Shema shouldn't look arai, temporary, like because you're still up the tree and working. So he says, even according to Rava, who holds, by the way, it's Rava who holds that the first pasuk is what you have to have kavana for, right? And still, Rava would agree that you shouldn't be working during the first paragraph. Okay, so that's what Rava says. Okay, so he says that the Rif says that according to everyone across the board, it's about having covered for Shema, and therefore, at least for the entirety of the first paragraph, one needs to concentrate. However, there are those who understand based on this Rif, the Rabbeinu Yonah understood that the Rif felt based on this ruling that really he's making a distinction based on the Gemara between the first paragraph and the other paragraphs, namely that the first paragraph is D'oraita. If we flip over the page to source 20, this is what Talmidei Rabbeinu Yonah, this is how they understand based on the Rif. See in source 20. Umitoch Masha Kataf HaRif, says Rabbeinu Yonah, based on that which we just read that the Rif wrote, Mishum de lo lishvei le arai, right? What did the Rif say? The reason that the first paragraph you have to stop your work for is so it shouldn't look like you're reading it in a temporary manner. Amru, they said the betelim melachtam b'chol perek harishon. That's why the Gemara says you shouldn't do malacha while you're reciting the first paragraph. Shma'inan, we learn from here, says Rabbeinu Yonah, the meperek rishon ve'elach eino ela midrabanan. So what's the Talmidei Rabbeinu Yonah and Medayek? They infer from the Rif that it's the entire first parasha, which is D'oraita, and the rest is Rabbanan. The im ita, because if it's true, the humin haTorah, that the rest of Shema is D'oraita, hava lana meichash, we should have been concerned. The lo lishvei lu arai, they shouldn't have the rest of the paragraphs. The whole shara prakim, the other paragraphs, we should have also been concerned not to read them in a temporary fashion. Ki heichi dechashina b'perek rishon, just as we do with the first one. In other words, Talmidei Rabbeinu Yonah infer from the Rif. The Rif holds the entire first paragraph is what is D'oraita. So we see now that there was one opinion, namely that of the Rashba, says only the first pasuk, which is D'oraita. Now we've seen that the Rabbeinu Yonah understands based on the Gemara and Brachot that according to the Rif, is the entire first paragraph, which is D'oraita, and the rest is D'Rabbanan. That's how they understand. This, by the way, is typically given as the explanation for Rashi. They bring it here, they say it's implied by Rashi. It seems to be the opinion of Rashi. It's pretty clear cut. And this gets back to your question, Jeff, about Kriyat Shema, Al-Hamita. Because let's look at this basically. Really, the first machlok at Rashi and Tosfot in Shas is really our sugya. How many paragraphs do you have to really recite Al-Hamita? That's really what they're basically discussing here. So let's see it inside in source 21. This is one of the Rashis on the first Rashis in Shas. Ad Sof. So what does Rashi say there in source 21? Lefikach, therefore, hakoreh kodem lachen, one who recites it beforehand, lo yatzai yedei chovato. It's talking there somebody who daven Ma'ariv early, the one who reads beforehand, has not fulfilled his obligation. Imken, if so, lama korena b'beit knesset. Why do we read, right? Why do we read Shema in shul? That's what Rashi asks. If you're not actually Yotze, the answer is when we do early Ma'ariv, why do we do Shema? So that it still counts as divrei Torah. In other words, even though you would have fulfill the obligation of Kriyat Shema when we do an early Ma'ariv, nonetheless, what do? We do have the kiyum of Talmud Torah. And therefore, says Rashi, this is why, says Rashi, it's an obligation upon us to read it when it gets dark. And it's enough to read the first paragraph of Shema, what we call Kriyat Shema Al-Hamita, Kriyat Shema when one goes to sleep. So says Rashi, if you do early Ma'ariv, you must repeat Shema after dark, but it's enough just to repeat the first paragraph of Al-Hamita. That's enough. In other words, and Tosfot, this I said, one of the first Machloket, Rashi and Tosfot in Shas. Tosfot jump on him here and they say that they didn't bring it. Surprised they didn't bring it. But Tosfot here say, immediately they say, we're talking about repeat 3 paragraphs. So, but Rashi clearly holds the first paragraph is sufficient. So we see that Rashi also joins this group. Perhaps the Rif also belonged to, at least Rabbeinu Yonah understood the Rif that way, that it's the first paragraph which is D'oraita and the rest is D'Rabbanan. That is regarding that. Look, we look at the Shari Tzurba here as well. He also brings that there those who understand that way that it's the first paragraph. But there are those because some wanted to say the Pri Chadash and others wanted to say that even the second paragraph is D'oraita, and the Shagad Arei disagreed, and that's brought here in source 22 in the Shari Tzurba. The Pri Chadash, look at the Pri Chadash, Shekatav, who wrote, Shegam Parshat Vahaya in Shama mi D'oraita. Right, the Pri Chadash says that also the Parshat Vahaya is D'oraita. But the Shagad Arei Hisigalav, whereas the Shagad Arei disagreed, the He'elan raised the issue. The Parshat Vahaya in Shama ein la ikameh Torah. The paragraph of Vahaya in Shama does not have any basis or source D'oraita. The Ein Kriyata Ela Midivrei Sofrim, it's only rabbinic. Of our Parshat Shema Kula, but the first paragraph of Shema Hu Min HaTorah below Sagi B'Pasuk Rishon Levad Ayin Sham. So there are many who say that really it is the first paragraph. The Pri Chadash wanted to suggest also the second paragraph is D'oraita, but many say it's the first paragraph. Rav Moshe Feinstein in the Tshuva wanted to also say that the second paragraph is D'oraita, but simply the Rishonim didn't really bring that as an opinion. He bases it on the comparison to what? He could base it on the comparison to mezuzah. What do we have in a mezuzah? Verse 2. In the mezuzah, we have two paragraphs of Shema. Uchtav tam al mezuzot beitecha v'sharecha. Mezuzot beitecha v'sharecha means two paragraphs, because you don't need the third paragraph, because the third paragraph is all about Zeicher, right? Zeicher L'Yetziat Mitzrayim. It's not relevant to the mezuzah necessarily. So you don't need that one, but the first two you do need. So it's a good limud to say that's what's D'oraita. If that's what you have to put on a mezuzah, presumably that's what's being spoken about in the psukim of the Dibarta Bam, right? And Al Levavech, right? That's what Moshe Feinstein's claim. But he says, what can I do that it wasn't really taken as a serious suggestion in the Rishonim? Let's see in source 23. He brings here in source 23, the Moshe Feinstein, Magen Avraham, the Magen Avraham wrote, Sif Kasachet, the Talmud Rabbeinu Yonah Sfir Lemi D'oraita Sarkot Pasha Rishona. Point to Rabbeinu Yonah that we saw that you have to read the first paragraph. Tamur Ma'od, it's very astonishing. Masha Hevia Magen Avraham b'Shem Talmidei Rabbeinu Yonah to Pasha Rishon Yatzah. It's astonishing that the Magen Avraham quotes this Talmidei Rabbeinu Yonah. The Chain Hu b'Rashi Reish Brachot. The Rashi that we also saw at the beginning, Masechet Brachot. Ma'ishna mezuzah. Why is it different from mezuzah? The Tzarech Lichtov Shtei HaParshiot. Why is it different from mezuzah? We're on page 135. Hello. You got to go now. You got to grab a whiskey now to make up for it. And you got to open to page 135. We're discussing how many paragraphs are D'oraita. Yeah, guys, get one for Isaac. No, so, no. Okay. Why is it different from mezuzah? So we've seen that the Rashba held the first pasuk D'oraita. The Rif perhaps, and we saw Rashi held that the first paragraph is D'oraita. Now, Igros Moshe on page 135 is asking, why is it different from mezuzah? In mezuzah, you need the first two paragraphs. Surely that implies that Shema also is the first two paragraphs which are D'oraita. And here also asks Rav Moshe Feinstein, given the Kai v'dibarta bam al kriyat Shema, since v'dibarta bam, you shall speak of them as referring to what? The kriyat Shema, but lo b'divrei Torah, not just learning Torah. Lamanda am kriyat Shema D'oraita. V'tzarech ion, it requires further investigation. So here really what Rav Moshe Feinstein would like to say, two paragraphs of D'oraita. But he doesn't conclude that way because Rishonim didn't really mention it as a serious thing, as a serious position. So we've seen here really we've seen here three suggestions as to which part of Kriyat Shema is D'oraita. We saw the Rashba, hello Danny, we saw the Rashba which said that according to the Rashba, the first pasuk is D'oraita and the first pasuk alone. But then we saw the Rif as understood by Rabbeinu Yonah and also the Rashi at the beginning of Brachot, that the first paragraph is D'oraita. And now we've seen that we saw the Pri Chadash and also Moshe Feinstein who wanted to suggest, based on what we learned from mezuzah, that it's in fact two paragraphs which are D'oraita and not just the first one or the first pasuk. What about the Rambam? So the Rambam brings a fourth approach, and the Rambam seems to imply that all three paragraphs of Shema are D'oraita. So if we look here, page 24, source 24 on page 135, the Rambam says as follows. In general writing about the mitzvah, he talks about all three paragraphs being part of that obligation. In source 24 here, the Rambam says, Pamim b'chol yom, pamaim b'chol yom korim kriyat Shema. Twice a day we read Shema. The erev v'boker shenemar, as it says, uv'shach b'cha uv'komecha. And then he goes on immediately over the page in the next halacha to say, umahu koreh. What is it that must one read according to the mandate of the pasuk? Shalosh parshiot elu. These 3 paragraphs, behain, which are Shema v'hayayim shamoa v'yomer. So he brings it all incorporated all in one. You see, the Rambam just says there's a mitzvah deraita to read Shema. What does one read? These 3 paragraphs. He doesn't differentiate between different paragraphs, which implies, according to the Rambam, that it is in fact it's all deraita. It's all part of the mitzvah deraita for Kriyat Shema. He goes on there. Makdimin lekrot parshat Shema. Why do we read Shema first? The Gemara discusses this, but he summarizes. Why do we read paragraph of Shema first? Does anyone know? He's going to tell us. First, it's all about, the first paragraph deals with the oneness of God, love of God, and studying basically the word of God. On which everything is dependent. Afterwards, we read the second paragraph. That comes second. Why? Because that's the command about all the other mitzvot, following all the other mitzvot. And only afterwards, Parshat Tzitzit, the paragraph of Tzitzit, that also talks about remembering all the mitzvot, right? Because we say, Hashem. So, and then he goes there. But if we look at the very end of that paragraph there, the end of the paragraph there, what does Rambam conclude there? Ukriyat shalosh parashiot elu al seder zehi hanikret kriyat shema. The reading of these 3 paragraphs in order, that is what's called Kriyat Shema. At no place does Rambam differentiate between the levels in different parashiot. He lumps all 3 together. So therefore, it's implied that according to Rambam, it's a mitzvah deraita to read all 3. And that's how Rambam understands. So we see from here, basically, we've been left. Oh, actually, they do it here, don't they? They bring here like 4 different opinions, basically, as to what the nature of what is deraita. Right, number 1, which is the Rashi calls of the Torah. Only the first verse, only the first pasuk of Shema is deraita. We saw the Rif Rabbeinu Yonah, and also we saw the Rashi at the beginning of Brachot that the first paragraph is deraita. Then we saw the Pri Chadash of Rav Moshe Feinstein, who said the second paragraph might also be deraita. And the Rambam seems to imply that all of Shema, all 3 paragraphs, are part of the Mishnah, of the mitzvah deraita. Now, what's fascinating is the Mishnah Berurah only brings the first 3 options, and he's not machriya. He doesn't give a ruling. He just brings different opinions. So if we look in the next source over the page 25, the Mishnah Berurah brings the first 3. Either it's the first pasuk, the first paragraph, or the first 2 paragraphs, which is deraita. But he's not machriya. He doesn't give a ruling as to which it is. Source 25, he says, V'da and no, says the Mishnah Berurah, the yesh gimel deyot ben apostle, 3 opinions. Yesh omrim, there are those that say the pasuk rishon bilvad hu min Torah, only the first pasuk is deraita. The yesh omrim, there are those that say the chol haparashah harishon hu min Torah, the entire first paragraph is min Torah. The yesh omrim, there are those that say the gam hashniya hu min Torah, the second paragraph is also deraita. The parshat tzitzit, the kule alma hu min Torah. So what about the third paragraph? Tzitzit, everyone agrees that's deraita, but for a different reason. Kedei lahazkir Yetziat Mitzrayim. In order to mention Yetziat Mitzrayim, the tiknu lahazkir bizman Kriyat Shema, which they enacted to recite at the time of Kriyat Shema. In other words, the third paragraph is deraita, but not necessarily as part of the mitzvah of Kriyat Shema, but because of another mitzvah of the mountains God Yom Tzeit Chametz Yisrael Chol Yom Mechayecha. Right, we should all be well versed in that pasuk by now after going through Pesach, and that's what the Mishnah Berurah says. So he brings all of them, but nonetheless. There's no real halachic nafkamina, practically speaking, as to whether it's all deraita or only part of it. Because we saw that the Shulchan Aruch had ruled that in a case of doubt, one anyway should recite all 3 again, because that's the original takana. That's how Chazal instituted it to be recited, and therefore, even if only elements of it are deraita, nonetheless, it should all be said again. So there are different opinions we've seen in the Rishonim, but in any case, really, there should be a need to repeat the whole thing. However, Mr. Berurah deals now with the following question: what happens with me? What happens if I know I recited the first paragraph of Shema, but I don't know if I recited the second paragraph of Shema? Then the whole thing might only be purely D'Rabbanan. I understand if I have to repeat all of Shema, then I should repeat the whole thing. But what happens if I know I recited the first paragraph of Shema, and I don't know why I dozed off, so I don't remember if I did that or I recited all of it. Somebody for example, went to bed and they just did one paragraph of Kriyat Shema al Hamita, and then suddenly they woke up and then they remembered, I did early Mariv, so I was supposed to redo all of Shema. And I can't remember if I did all 3 paragraphs or not. So in that case, do you have to repeat the second paragraph? That would be a halachic nafkamina based on the approaches that we've seen as to whether it's deraita or derabanan. So this is what Mr. Brewer suggests here. I think it's quite a far-fetched nafkamina. That I said I started to invent a case now as when that would happen. If you davened early Mariv, you went to bed and you woke up in the middle of the night, you can't remember when you went to bed if you recited all 3 paragraphs or just the first one. Otherwise, it's quite far removed nafkamina. But that's what he brings as a halachic nafkamina. In source 26, Lachara, he says, the Mishnah Berurah, Afal gav the harbe poskim sovrim, even though many poskim hold the parasha rishonahu mid'oraita, that the first paragraph is d'oraita for shnei u'drabanan, the second one is d'rabanan. The yesh mina poskim, those poskim which are sovrim who hold the rak pasuk rishon mid'oraita. For koshken, how much more so the brachot of Kriyat Shema, the kule almahu midrabanan. It's all, everyone agrees the brachot practically drabanan. The safek drabanan ein a you should not go back for a doubt on the drabanan. Yesh lomar, you might say, kach haitata kana. This was the decree. Shakol man shakorin. Whenever you read, chayav likrot ikar katana v'ripetah. The same thing that we saw in the Rashba, right? That you should read it properly as it was instituted. All 3 paragraphs again. Unless they said explicitly you don't have to. Like elsewhere. But it would seem, says the Mishnah Berurah, im yodea, we're in the bold there, im yodea she'amar pasuk rishon or pash rishona, you know for sure that you did read the first pasuk or the first paragraph, l'chol achat min hadei, point to everyone, but safek lem karahasha, you can't remember if you read the rest, ein tzarich lachzav v'likrot. So that is the only nafkamina really that the Mishnah Berurah rules in, which is that if you don't know if you read the second paragraph of Shema, you don't have to go back. After dark, you don't have to go back and read it. It's a bit of a weird nafkamina.
So isn't there a prescribed chazaka anyway? Like if you've always been saying, if you regularly say all 3 paragraphs of Shema, and it's your normal behavior to do so. It's sort of like when we've changed from, we say when we changed to 10 bracha or 10 Talmud Tava, it's after 30 days.
We're talking here about.
Been saying it.
I hear what you're saying, but we're talking here really about somebody who davened Shema. We're talking about someone davened Mariv early, and then they can't remember if they then later recited Kriyat Shema.
If they've always do that. They always daven early, and they normally say they repeat Shema nighttime, and once they've woken up to did I or didn't I? Isn't it presumed that
that might not be a suffix. That might not be a suffix then.
Yeah,
that might not be a case of doubt. But I don't know. Now I daven late Mariv here, but sometimes in England, you always did early Mariv, whatever it was, because in the summer in England it's 10:30 as Shabbos goes out. So. Everyone does early Mariv. So I just, as a habit, I always said 3 paragraphs of Shema before I went to sleep. My Kriyat Shema, I always did 3 paragraphs. Then it's a good safety net. So
when you did your early Marivs, did you do early Spheres?
In England?
In England.
No, but that's because Mariv was before Shkia. It was after plug, obviously, but before Shkia. And the leniency doesn't typically extend to before Shkia.
Right.
After Shkia, there's more room, like we do here. But,
yes. Okay.
But so it was a late one for Sphere in England. It's a late one. But yeah. Okay. So that's regarding paragraphs. Again, just to summarize, we saw an array of opinions here. We saw the Rashba who said only the first pasuk is d'oraita. Right, possibly based on that Gemara, which says you have to have extra kavana in the first pasuk, which we're going to deal with later on. Then we had the Rif, and we had, in addition to the Rif, we had the who else did we have? We had the Rif, Rabbi Yonah and Rashi, beginning of Brachot, who said the first paragraph is d'oraita. Then we had the Pri Chadash and Moshe Feinstein, based on Mezuzah, who wanted to suggest that the first and second paragraphs are d'oraita, and finally, perhaps the implication of the Rambam that the entire thing is d'oraita. Practically speaking, one who's unsure if they said Kriyat Shema at all, should repeat all three, because that's the way it was enacted. But we saw that if one knows that they said the first paragraph, but for some bizarre reason they can't remember if they said the second, Mishnah Berurah said then perhaps one would not have to repeat, because that would be D'Rabbanan according to many opinions. So now we proceed to talking about kavanah, right? There's different types of kavanah, which we're going to cover, because there's two things of kavanah here. One is kavanah, right? One kavanah is like all mitzvot. Mitzvot tzrichot kavanah. There's a requirement that all mitzvot have to have kavanah. We'll talk about that in a moment. That's also a matter of debate. And the second kavanah is actual kavanah for the words, in understanding and being aware of what it is you're reading. Specifically, when you have a mitzvah, which is reading, then kavanah becomes an important concept. So there's two things here. On the one hand, we have kavanah, meaning just like every mitzvah has the kavanah, I'm intending to do a mitzvah. And then there's kavanah in terms of actually understanding the words. So that's what the Gemara deals with here. Okay, so first the Gemara we're going to look at now, but first the Mishnah. This is the first Mishnah in the second parak of Brachot. So I believe it's Brachot Yud Gimel, but it's the first Mishnah in source 27. The Mishnah says, "Haya koreh b'Torah v'hegia zman hamikra." So what happens if you were learning Torah, you're reading Torah, and it happened to be the time of Kriyat Shema arrived, and you happen to be anyway reading those parashiot. Im kiven libo yatsa. If you had kavana, you fulfill the obligation of Kriyat Shema just by reading Shema. Ve'im lav, and if not, lo yatsa. You do not. So what ensues there in the Gemara is great discussions about the requirements for kavana that one may have to have. So that's what the Gemara discusses. But clearly, according to the Mishnah here, there's a requirement for some form of kavana in order to be yotzer you're reading, right? It's not enough just to happen to be reading a siddur or reading a Sefer Torah, whatever it is. That's not sufficient. It has to be some sort of kiven libo, some sort of kavana. The question is, what level of kavana is really required? Okay, I think I just accidentally skipped. Where are we at? Okay, we are right 28. Okay, so really this deals with the Gemara there in the subsequent Gemara deals with the general machloket regarding whether mitzvot in general need kavanah. So that's the first type of kavanah, which is what we're going to talk about today, is just the regular generic mitzvot tzrichot kavanah. Do you have to have special kavanah before Shema tonight? I am going to fulfill the mitzvah of Kriyat Shema. So it's a machloket in the Gemara, and discussed as follows in Rosh Hashanah, as we're going to see, as well as in the Gemara in Brachot, which is our context. So the Gemara says as follows in Rosh Hashanah, source 28. They sent to the fathers of Shmuel. If somebody was forced, they forced somebody to eat matzah. And Rashi adds here, even though he didn't have kavana to actually eat matzah, yatsa, he's fulfilled his obligation. Amar Rava says, Zotomeret, this implies, Hatoker Shiur, if somebody were to blow shofar just for music, because they're so inclined that the shofar is so musical, yatsa, they fulfill the obligation. Alma, we see from here, says the Gemara, Kasava Rava holds, mitzvot ein tzrichot kavanah. So based on the father of Shmuel said that somebody who forcibly eats matzah, is forced to eat matzah, fulfills the obligation, and Rava's extension that somebody who just happens to be blowing shofar because they want to make funny sounds or nice sounds, without kavanah, they still fulfill the obligation. This would imply, according to Rava, mitzvot do not require special kavanah. But over the page, we see the Gemara continues there. And there are those that disagree with Rava and say, no, of course, mitzvot require kavanah. So Eitivei, so they asked, the Gemara raises a question on Rava based on the Mishnah. What did the Mishnah say? Haya koreh b'Torah v'hegia zman hamikra. If somebody was learning Torah, as we saw in the Mishnah, right, that we just read in Brachot, and it happens to reach the time of reading Shema, im kiven libo yatsa v'im lav lo yatsa. If he brings his heart to attention, then he fulfills obligation, and if not, he's not. Right, that's the Mishnah we saw in Brachot. What does kiven libo literally mean? It means like to focus one's heart, right? That would imply that you need to actually have active kavanah. So that's what the Gemara asks. My love, is this not kiven libo latzet? That one has directed one's heart in order latzet to fulfill the obligation. So this is a good kasha, a good question on Rava. Rava said you don't need kavanah. The Mishnah in Brachot clearly says that if somebody who's reading the Shema and it happens to be the time of Shema, what do they have to do? they have to actually have to have special kavanah. And the Gemara says, what does it mean? Kiven libo, you have to direct your heart. It means kiven libo, that's it. You have to fulfill. The Gemara rejects this and says, lo, no, what does it mean? It means likrot. You have to focus your heart on to read. In other words, be extra careful that you're reading it properly. So how would Rava deal with our Mishnah? Our Mishnah seems to be quite clear. Our Mishnah seems to say what? That if you have to lechaven libo, to focus one's heart, right? And he didn't, right? So he says, what does Rava say? What does it mean? It means kiven libo means pay attention to the words, pay attention to the reading, likrot, to read it. Which the Gemara says likrot. What do you mean pay attention to read? Hakakare, surely he's reading. The Gemara says we're talking about what case? Bekore lehagia, talking about somebody who is being magia, somebody who's correcting, like a sofer who's going over it to correct it. And as they're going over the Sefer Torah, or they're going over the Siddur, whatever it is, they're reading it. So you tell him, kiven libo means to have kavana, according to Rava. You don't need kavana to fulfill the obligation of Shema. What does it mean to have kavana? It means to pay attention to the words. Make sure you're actually reading it as you go over. So a sofer who's going over the Siddur or whatever it is, or the mezuzah and whatever it is they're doing, and they're going over the parshiot, the tefillin, whatever it is, what are they doing? And make sure kiven libo means make sure that you're actually reading the words out loud as you go along. And therefore Rava does not actually require kavana, special kavana for mitzvot, because he understands the Mishnah differently. But not everyone agrees. Amalei Rabbi Zera l'shmai. Rabbi Zera said to his servant, "Ichaven etzakali." This is on Rosh Hashanah. Have kavana and blow the shofar for me. Alma, what do we see from here? Kasava mashmiya by kavana. We see from here that the person who's blowing the shofar needs kavana. So Rabbi Zera disagrees with Rava. So on the one hand, we have Rava who says mitzvot needs special intent, and we have Rabbi Zera. So Rabbi Zera says mitzvot needs special intent. And on the other hand, we have Rava. Rava says mitzvot do not need special intent. Okay, that is the split with which we find ourselves. So how do we rule? What's the halacha? The mitzvot need kavana or not? We have Rava on the one hand says it doesn't, and he understands our Mishnah and Brachot differently. On the other side, we have Rabbi Zera who says you have to have kavana. So, like everything, it's a good old machloket rishonim. Surprise, surprise, right? No guesses, right? For you. There we go. Excellent. So let's see the. I didn't bring my turntable.
But at the end of the day, the conclusion of the Gemara is mitzvah and a strifas kavana of that sugya.
The problem is there are multiple there, but Rabbi Zera comes after Rava in the Gemara. It talks about different levels of Kabbalah in Brachot and Rosh Hashanah. So that's the issue with it.
The shofar is difficult because the mitzvah is not on the person who's blowing, the mitzvah is on the person who's listening. So the intention of the person who's blowing is secondary. It's the person who's listening that you'd have to look at. And the other question is, it's talking about Rav Zera's servant. So Rav Zera's servant has no obligation to fulfill mitzvot anyway.
You're assuming it's an Eved Canaan. They're Rishonim asks that. Assuming it's an Eved Canaan, maybe it's an Eved Ivri.
Yes.
So it's a good. That's one of the answers. Eved Canaan, you're right, is exempt from shofar. But the question is, well, can a woman blow shofar for a man? Same thing, because right, an Eved Canaan is chayav mitzvot ki isha. Yeah,
women don't, strictly speaking, don't have an obligation.
Now we're not at Rosh Hashanah yet, but now we're going into the halachic sugya of, well, is it a din of shmiya? Is it a din of takia? And therefore, does it matter if the person who's blowing it is a bar chiyuv? Yes, but yeah. But the question which is brought up there. Oops, I skipped down a bit. Where did we go? Who has the right?
29.
29. Okay, 29. We are on 29. Okay, I got it. Okay, so that's the Gemara brings multiple opinions. Okay, the Beit Yosef. Here we go. Source 29. So Beit Yosef brings there's a machloket rishonim regarding how we rule. So unlike what Danny wanted to say, the Rif says the Rif did not bring Rava. He brought Rabbi Zera. But Harif lo hevi at divrei Rava. He skips this there. The Rif omits the opinion of Rava. Ela divrei Rabbi Zera. He just brings the opinion of Rabbi Zera, which is at the end of the Gemara, the mitzvah require kavana. And he tells his servant to have kavana when he blows the shofar. Okay, v'chatav harosh, and the Rosh writes, Dehainu mishum desfirleg dehachi hilchata. The Rosh understood the fact that the Rif omitted the opinion of Rava and just put Rabbi Zera. The Rif's way of politely paskening the halacha is like Rabbi Zera, mitzvot require kavana. Afal gav the Rava v'hanach the shalchu lavo the shmor savri the mitzvot einam shricha kavana. Even the Rava, those who sent the ruling for the Abu of Shmuel that we saw in the Gemara hold that mitzvot do not require kavana. Hilchata Rabbi Zera. Halacha follows Rabbi Zera. V'chein pasak bal halacha gedolot, and then similarly the Bahag passes this way as well, that mitzvot require kavana. So the Rif and the Bahag both paskin like Rabbi Zera, mitzvot require kavana. For Garsina Nami Yerushalmi, that seems to be the reading of our version of the Yerushalmi. Haya'ove acharei beit hakneset, somebody who was walking behind the shul. Hada amra mitzvot shricha kavana, and the Gemara there talks about somebody who, there it's talking about the shofar and the like, that the halacha is that mitzvot require kavana. V'chein pasak Rambam. The Rambam also passes this way. Perek bet mehilchot shofar. What does the Rambam write about shofar? Shofar, the tzarech sheyitz kaven mashmiya lahotzi v'shomer latzet. The person who's blowing the shofar has to have kavanah to make everyone fulfill their obligation, and the listener also has to have kavanah to fulfill the obligation, which is literally taking the words out of Rabbi Zera's mouth, right? Halav hachi, without this, lo yatsa. One has not fulfilled their obligation. So we have the Rif, we have the Rosh, and we have the Rambam, who seem to paskin, and the Bahag, who seem to paskin that mitzvot require kavanah. But not everyone agrees. Aval, however, says Beit Yosef, that harbem the Gaonim, many of the Gaonim held, the Kaimalan that we follow, that mitzvot ain tzrichot kavanah. V'chein dat harashba zal. Rashba also held that mitzvot do not require kavanah. But in halacha, regarding the practical halacha, kivan de harif v'harambam v'harosh maskinim the mitzvot tzrichot kavanah hachi naktina. We rule like the Rif, Rambam, and Rosh. As a general rule of thumb, Shulchan Aruch usually follows the majority opinion of the Rif, the Rambam, and the Rosh. Here, unanimously, the Rif, the Rambam, and the Rosh all rule the mitzvot shrichot kavanah, and therefore mitzvot. That's how the Shulchan Aruch rules. He actually brings it as a yesh omrim v'yesh omrim. Typically, yesh omrim v'yesh omrim. The halacha is always like the second yesh omrim, and if there were any doubt, he says so explicitly here. In source 30, says the Shulchan Aruch, yesh omrim. There are those that say she'ein mitzvot shrichot kavanah. Mitzvot do not require kavanah. The yesh omrim. There are those that say shrichot kavanah. Let's say b'asiyat utam mitzvah. V'chein halacha. That's the halacha. The mitzvot do require kavanah. So, therefore, the Shulchan Aruch rules that mitzvot do require kavanah. He brings both opinions, but rules that mitzvot do require kavanah, like the Rif, the Rambam, and the Rosh. The Mishnah Berurah makes an important point here that, again, there are two different types of kavanah, right? There's the intent for the mitzvah itself, and there's intent to actually fulfill the mitzvah. Those are the two things that we mentioned before.
A question is on that. If you take the basic mitzvah of Brit Milah, is the mitzvah of Brit Milah on the mohel to perform the Brit Milah, or on the person to have a Brit Milah? Because I dare say that an 8-year-old
on
baby
the father,
does not have
while they're a katan, it's on the father.
Yeah, Ben.
On the father. Father makes the bracha of Sivan Lachniso B'Vrito Shel Avraham Avinu. Why the mohel makes the bracha al hamilah? Because he's the one who's practically doing the milah. But the mitzvah is on the father.
So
if you like, the mitzvah is on the. If you like it, if you would like, the mitzvah is on the father to ensure that the child is nimol. Does that answer your question by being very obscure? But essentially, that's really the mitzvah. And eventually, it becomes on the person. Okay. So the Mishnah Berurah here clarifies there are two types of kavanah, which we've mentioned above. Let's just see them aside briefly. In source 31, no, says the Mishnah Berurah. Two types of kavanah. Aleph, the first type is kavanat halev, intention of the heart, la mitzvah atzma, for the mitzvah itself. Ubet, meaning to concentrate on the mitzvah itself. Ubet, and the second type of kavanah, which we're dealing with now, which is kavanah letzeitba, intent to actually fulfill the mitzvah. Dahainu, which means shechaven lekayem bazeh, to fulfill by doing this action, kasher tzivah Hashem. Right, like the Bach writes. Okay, so that's what's being discussed here. Now, the intent of the mitzvah being referred to here in the seif, regarding, it's talking here about fulfilling the obligation rather than paying attention to the mitzvah. So he says, "Ein taloi klal b'kavanat halev, the mitzvah atzma We're not talking here about the kavana of one's heart, that specific mitzvah. He's not talking about kavana as concentration. That's the other type. We're going to discuss that next in our next chapter in this book. But we're not talking here about kavana for the words. Kavana is in concentration of the words. But we're not talking about focusing and not to think and be distracted with other things. We're going to kriyat shema tefillah, like kriyat shema and tefillah or birkat hamazon and benching and kiddush v'kadom, anything that you do orally. Because this l'kulei alma, everyone agrees. Mitzvah lechatchila mitzvah shechavim belibo. Everyone agrees that really when it comes to kavana in the sense of concentration, that everyone agrees ideally you have to have that sort of kavana. But if you didn't concentrate, nonetheless one fulfills the obligation. What's the exception? Levad mi pasuk rishon shel kriyat shema. Apart from the first pasuk kriyat shema, everyone agrees you must, even b'di'evet, have had kavana for the first pasuk. But birkat avot shel tefillah and the first bracha of Amida as well. So here we're not talking about kavana as in concentration and focusing. We're here talking about right before you start, saying to yourself, I am about to fulfill the mitzvah deraita to do X or Y. So that's what we're talking about here. So he says in the bold, the last paragraph there, Rak shemechulakim, the machloka here is regarding what? The inyan regarding im chayav lechaven kodem shematchil hamitzvah, whether one before starting the mitzvah has to have kavana, let's say, to fulfill their legal halachic obligation, but asiyat ota mitzvah, and the performance of this mitzvah. But everyone agrees ideally one should have kavana. And the question is whether it's ma'akev, what we call halachic terms, whether it's ma'akev, whether it prevents or withholds one from action to fulfill the mitzvah. So that's what the Mishnah Berurah says here. We're discussing what? We're discussing the kavana letset, kavana to fulfill one's obligation. That is the question which the Gemara was having a machloket about, the Rishonim were having a machloket about, and ultimately, what did the Shulchan Aruch rule? That you have to have kavana. What kavana? Kavana to fulfill one's obligation. Okay. And what happens if one didn't have kavana? Once we rule the mitzvah sricha kavana, you've got to do it again, right? And that's what we see in source 32. Over the page, Mishnah Berurah says, sricha kavana says to Mishnah Berurah, v'im lo kiven letzei yidei chavato ba'asiyat mitzvah. If one did not have kavana to fulfill the obligation, lo yatsa min haTorah, one has not fulfilled his obligation. But tzarich lachzor v'la'asotah, one must do it again. But afilu im safek lo im kiven, even if one is in doubt whether they've done it or not, imhu mitzvah d'oraita, one was in the safek d'oraita, sveika l'chumra, we machmer, you have to repeat it. Ken katav prima gadim, ayin sham. That's what the prima gadim writes. So that's what we see. We see the Mishnah Berurah here rules that it's ma'akev. Kavana, the idea of mitzvah sricha kavana, you have to have kavana to do the mitzvah d'oraita is ma'akev. And if you don't have kavana, you have to do it again. There are some exceptions, which we're going to see in a moment.
Sorry? That's only if the mitzvah of having to have kavana is a mitzvah d'oraita.
I disagree. I know what you're getting at there, but I think it's an inherent part of each mitzvah. They have to have kavana.
It's not a separate mitzvah.
It's not a separate mitzvah. It's not like one of the 613 is to have kavana for mitzvah. No, it's inherent in each mitzvah. There are exceptions. We'll start now, but time won't allow us to get through them all. But there are various exceptions as to when even the Mishnah Berurah considers that b'di'evad post facto, if one didn't have kavana, what we're calling now kavana letset, kavana to fulfill one's obligation, nonetheless, it's okay. So let's see that inside. So the number one is, what about when the action itself, anyway, or the context of the action seems to imply that one had kavana, even if the one didn't explicitly say beforehand to oneself, I am having kavana. It talks here about like matzah and the like, that sort of thing, where the action is clearly one which is one which is of kavana.
Which is
so he says here, sorry,
which is intentional. I mean, you don't need matzah.
Right. You're sitting at Seder night, you're eating a matzah, but you didn't say beforehand to yourself, right, mitzvah d'oraita. So let's see what he says about that, and we might end off with that. With that order, no furthermore, says the Mishnah Berurah. The kataf achai adam b'chlal samachet, the mashim mitzrachin alei lachzor v'lasot ha-mitzvah, that's which you have to go back and redo the mitzvah. Hainu b'makom sheyesh litzlot, that's only when one should assume she'asiyah harishana la hayta l'shem mitzvah. You should assume that the first act was not done for the sake of a mitzvah. Kogon, such as b'tzakiyah shayta lehit lamed, You weren't blowing shofar, you were just practicing. Or you were learning the Kriyat Shema texts, but you weren't actually reading them, and the like, where the context is clear that it wasn't necessarily an act of a mitzvah. Aval, however, im koreh Kriyat Shema, if he's reading Kriyat Shema, kederech she'anu korim b'seder tefillah, he's reading Kriyat Shema in davening. V'chen, and similarly, kisha'achal matzah, right? You're sitting at Seder night eating matzah. O taka b'natal lulav, right? And he goes and he takes the lulav. Afal pi shelo kiven letzet, even though he didn't have so otaka there. That's why I was confused. Otaka, so he blew shofar, like on Rosh Hashanah, v'natal lulav, and takes lulav on Sukkot. Afal pi shelo kiven letzet, even though one did not have kavanah explicitly to fulfill the obligation, yatsa, they fulfilled the obligation. Shahare mishum ze oseh kedei letzet afal pi she'ena mechaven. That's the whole reason he's doing it, right? Why are you taking a lulav on Rosh Hashanah, on Sukkot? Well, too many whiskeys. Why am I taking a lulav on Sukkot? Why am I blowing shofar on Rosh Hashanah? And I'll ask you, you'll say, because it's Sukkot, I've got to do the mitzvah. It's Rosh Hashanah, I've got to hear the shofar. What do you mean? So says the Chayei Adam, that is the kavanah. Why else are you taking ad kalashona? That's what the Chayei Adam understands. So exception number one is when it's implicit in why you're doing it, that you've got kavanah. For Tzon Lamar, his intention is heicha demuchach, where it's obvious, it's clear, lefiha inyan, based on the context, she'asiyatohu k'dei latzet, that one's doing it in order to fulfill his obligation, afal pi shelo kiven b'feirush, even though one didn't have kavanah explicitly, yatsa, one has nonetheless fulfilled the obligation. Aval b'stama, but where it's just not clear, v'vadai lo yatsa, for sure one has not fulfilled the obligation. K'di'ita b'tosfot sukkah, as is the case in Tosfot in Sukkah. So basically, context is important. But he adds, this is all obviously b'di'eved, post facto, but ideally you should still have kavanah. Because elinyan b'di'eved, but ideally in the outset, vadai tzarech lizaher, one should be careful, the kaven, to have kavanah, kodem, kol mitzvah, before each mitzvah, let's say, yidei chovat mitzvah, v'chein he'etiku kol ha'rachanim b'sifreihem. So this is all b'di'eved. Chachila one, of course, must have a mitzvah. But exception number one that we've seen, and we'll continue next week on exception number two, which is mitzvah d'Rabbanan. The exception number one is where the context is very important in the mitzvah. We'll stop there. We have Mariv now next door, and things are loud next door, which is always a good sign. So it's nice to hear a loud Beit Midrash. And yeah, I hope to see more of you. I'd love to see more of you back in person. It's so slowly I'll reel you in. I'll have to bring down the quality of the Zoom connection. You know. So and Michael, we don't have much choice with you, Michael, unless you want to come back anytime. But
that's it. I hear that comment all the time.
Michael, are you back, Michael? Where are you, Michael? You're still in Israel. You're in Israel, right? Good.
I'm here till the end of June.
okay.
Lovely to see you. You did tell me, but I forgot. Lovely to see you. That's great.
Take care, everyone. Have a good evening.
Here's a picture out my window. There you go.